If you're interested in lesser-known but pivotal moments from World War II that changed everything, moments where a single mistake, a slip of fate, or an act of human vulnerability shifted the entire trajectory of the Pacific War, then you need to subscribe to this channel right now. Because today, we're diving into one of the most extraordinary and haunting true stories from naval history, a story that most people have never heard, but which determined the fate of thousands of sailors and ultimately the entire outcome of the war itself. So hit that subscribe button and let's go. The Pacific Ocean in October 1944 was a vast, dark hunting ground. The water was cold, deeper than any man could fathom, and filled with invisible threats. Above the surface, American destroyers and escort vessels cut through the waves in coordinated patterns, their sonar operators hunched over headsets, listening to the ocean as if it were a symphony of death. Below, somewhere in the thermocline layer, where sound behaves strangely, where pressure turns steel into something almost alive with tension, Japanese submarines prowled. They were desperate, they were hungry, and they were becoming ghosts. The Japanese Navy had lost the initiative in the Pacific 2 years earlier. At Midway in 1942, their carrier fleet had been shattered. Since then, they had been fighting a war of attrition, watching their ships sink one by one, their pilots become fewer with each engagement, their supply lines stretch thinner across thousands of miles of ocean. The submarine arm of the Imperial Japanese Navy had become one of their last true weapons, not dominant, but still dangerous. And in those submarines, sailors spent weeks submerged in steel tubes, no wider than a freight car, breathing air that grew thick with moisture and the smell of diesel fuel, human sweat, and the metallic taste of fear. For the Japanese, silence was survival. A submarine detected was a submarine condemned. And so, in the technological workshops of the Navy Ministry in Tokyo, and in the minds of engineer officers who understood that they were losing a war measured in tonnage and lives, a new drive system had been conceived. It was not revolutionary in principle. Many nations had theorized about such things, but in execution, it represented a careful step towards something that might give their submarines an edge they desperately needed. A system that would allow their boats to move through the water with less acoustic signature, to hide better in the depths, to survive a little longer. The system was incomplete, still experimental, prone to mechanical failures that could cripple a boat or kill an entire crew. But it was what they had, and it was being installed carefully, methodically, on select boats that might carry it into combat and, if they were fortunate, back home again. Captain Isamu Tanaka of the Imperial Japanese Navy had served submarines for nearly a decade. He was 43 years old, a quiet man with steady hands and the kind of fatigue that comes from knowing too much about war. He had watched friends die in the depths. He had felt the terrible concussive force of depth charges detonating against his boat's hull, an experience that most people have no frame of reference for. No way to truly understand. The way sound becomes physical. The way your body feels as though the ocean itself is trying to crush you. The way every rivet on the submarine groans as if the boat itself is crying out. He had surfaced to rescue survivors from other Japanese ships, only to have to dive again and leave men behind because the Americans were coming. These were the experiences that had carved themselves into his face and his bearing. The boat he commanded, the I-class submarine designated for this new trial, was one of the Navy's largest submarines. It had been designed in another era, when the Japanese Navy had still possessed the confidence of superiority. Now, in this late phase of the war, it was modified constantly, refitted with new equipment, its interior crowded with machinery that had been added but never removed. The new drive system had been installed 4 weeks prior, and Tanaka had been ordered to test it, to take it out into contested waters and evaluate its performance. There were no guarantees that it would work. There were no guarantees that he would come back. But come back he had several times, returning with preliminary data that the Navy said was promising. And so another mission was ordered, another patrol into waters where American vessels were known to operate, another chance to test this fragile advantage. The night of the incident came as most nights at sea come, as an anticlimax. There was no sense of impending disaster, no premonition, no sign. Tanaka was in his small quarters off the control room, reviewing charts and orders with two of his junior officers. The boat moved at periscope depth, the conning tower just barely above the surface of the water, watching and listening. The new drive system hummed quietly in the engine room, its acoustic profile lower than conventional diesel engines, a difference subtle but measurable to those who listened with sophisticated instruments. What neither Tanaka nor anyone on his boat knew was that an American destroyer, the USS Kendrick, had also become aware of an acoustic anomaly. The sonar operator, Petty Officer Third Class David Hartley, had been on watch for 6 hours straight, his ears adjusted to the symphony of ocean sounds. He could distinguish between whale calls and distant ship propellers, between the metallic ping of their own sonar and the hollow echo of a submarine's pressure hull. He had heard the Japanese boat 2 hours ago, a bearing change that brought it closer to their position. And then something strange happened. For reasons that would later be attributed to a combination of mechanical failure, human error, and simple bad luck, the new drive system on the Japanese submarine experienced a catastrophic failure. It wasn't the kind of failure that creates a dramatic explosion or a sudden loss of power. Instead, it was something worse for a submarine. It created a massive acoustic signature. The drive system, designed to be quiet, began to resonate at a frequency that made it sound, to the sophisticated American sonar, like nothing they had heard before. It was distinctive, unusual, and unmistakably present. Hartley heard it and sat bolt upright. He called his lieutenant. The USS Kendrick's captain received the report, and within minutes, a decision had been made. They would move to investigate. They would attempt to locate the source, and if it was indeed a Japanese submarine, they would attack. Below, Tanaka felt the immediate vibration change. An engineer reported the anomaly. A decision had to be made in seconds. Continue on, hoping the sound signature went unnoticed, or dive deeper and alter course. Tanaka chose to dive, but as the boat angled down, taking on water into the ballast tanks, something else went wrong. A valve mechanism, corroded by months at sea, failed to seal properly. Not completely, just enough to create an air leak, small but audible through water. By the time the Japanese submarine reached 200 feet, the Americans had a solid sonar contact. By the time it reached 300 feet, the American destroyer had locked onto them. The captain of the USS Kendrick gave the order to prepare depth charges. What followed was not a sudden attack, but a drawn-out hunt. Sonar contact was difficult to maintain at depth. The submarine could move, could attempt to evade, but with each course change, with each maneuver, the new drive system continued to produce that distinctive acoustic signature, a beacon that marked their position. In the control room of the Japanese submarine, with sweat running down faces and the smell of human fear mixing with diesel oil, Tanaka made a calculation. The boat was damaged. The new drive system was failing. They could not outrun a destroyer. They could not hide. And he was carrying not just a boat full of sailors, but something else. The new propulsion system, still mounted in the engine room, still partially integrated into the boat systems, still accessible because it had not been fully installed on a permanent basis. It was, in fact, designed to be modular, removable if necessary. The American destroyer dropped the first pattern of depth charges. The sound was not like anything a man could ever become accustomed to, a series of explosions that seemed to come from everywhere at once, the shock waves passing through the boat like the hand of God. 3 charges, 4, 5. Men screamed, though they tried not to. Equipment shattered. Water began to seep in from seal failures. Tanaka gave an order. Not to surface, not to surrender. No Japanese officer would do that in 1944. Instead, he ordered his chief engineer to begin the process of disconnecting the new drive system. If they were going to die anyway, which seemed increasingly likely, then at least they would prevent the Americans from claiming this system. They would damage it, disconnect it, and sink it in the deepest part of the Pacific. But in the chaos, in the darkness made worse by the failure of electrical systems, in the confusion of men trying to follow orders while experiencing something akin to terror, something went wrong. The modular connections of the drive system, designed for quick assembly, were also designed for relatively quick disassembly. But in the hands of sailors working in panic, working in darkness, working with the knowledge that their boat was dying around them, one of the major components, a metal casing containing the essential acoustic dampening mechanism, the heart of the system, was disconnected but not destroyed. And as it was being lifted from its mounting position, ready to be passed up through the companionway to the upper decks where it could be thrown overboard with weights attached, the boat shuddered with another explosion, another depth charge, closer this time. The compartment filled with smoke and debris. Someone slipped. The component fell. And in that moment, in that single moment of human weakness and circumstance, it rolled across the deck and became jammed in a partially open hatch that led to the ballast tank access tunnel. The USS Kendrick's sonar operators heard something different then, a secondary sound, a metallic resonance that suggested structural damage. They knew they had hit something. The captain ordered more depth charges, but beneath them, something extraordinary was happening. Tanaka gave the order to surface. It was suicide to surface in daylight, in the presence of enemy destroyers. But the alternative was to sink in darkness, to let the ocean crush their hull at depth. Better to surface and fight with whatever anti-aircraft guns they possessed, to at least get some men off the boat, to at least try. The Japanese submarine rose through the water. The pressure lessened. The submarine broke the surface with a sound like a dying whale, water cascading down its hull. The conning tower emerged. The deck gun crew rushed to their stations. And on the deck, trailing a line that should not have been there, the metal casing containing the acoustic dampening mechanism of the new drive system, caught on a piece of rigging. The Americans, seeing a submarine surface directly in front of them, responded with immediate and overwhelming force. Machine gun fire raked the Japanese boat's deck. The anti-aircraft guns began to fire, but with no effect. The destroyer's deck gun spoke once, twice, 3 times. The Japanese submarine's pressure hull was breached. The order to abandon ship was given. Men poured out of the conning tower and down the sides of the hull into the water. Some were in life vests, others were not. The Japanese boat, crippled and dying, began to slip beneath the surface, and as it did, the metal casing containing the acoustic system, still tangled in the rigging, did not go down with the ship. Instead, it became caught in a piece of floating debris suspended in the water, buoyant enough to stay near the surface. The captain of the USS Kendrick ordered his men to stop firing. He ordered rescue operations to begin, not out of mercy, but out of practical military consideration. Survivors could be interrogated. The casing, visible in the water, was something else entirely. No one knew what it was. It was Japanese. It was metallic. It was clearly part of some kind of mechanical system. An American sailor, his name was Robert Kinney, a young man from Kansas who had joined the Navy because it seemed better than working in the Dust Bowl, was lowered over the side in a small boat to retrieve survivors and investigate. He saw the casing, reached for it and pulled it aboard. It was heavy, sealed, definitely designed to serve some purpose. What purpose, he could not know. What followed was one of the most significant intelligence coups of the Pacific War, though it took months for anyone to fully understand its importance. The casing was brought aboard the USS Kendrick, cleaned, photographed, and logged into the evidence inventory. It was reported up the chain of command. Within 48 hours, it had been transferred to a naval intelligence facility in Pearl Harbor. Within a week, it had been delivered to a team of naval engineers and acoustic specialists who worked in a secure facility on the island of Oahu. a team whose work was classified at the highest levels, whose mission was to understand Japanese naval technology and identify ways to counter it. The men who examined it were mostly civilians, brilliant acoustic engineers and physicists who had been recruited for the duration of the war. They worked in a laboratory filled with specialized instruments that could measure vibrations and frequencies with extraordinary precision. They had access to technical databases and specifications. And they had something else, the actual physical object, the thing itself, which is always more revealing than a blueprint or a description. What they discovered, piece by piece, as they carefully disassembled and examined the mechanism, was a sophisticated approach to acoustic dampening. It was not magical, not revolutionary, but it was clever. It used a series of small, precisely angled chambers that disrupted sound wave propagation. It employed a kind of controlled friction system that absorbed vibrational energy. It represented several years of Japanese submarine development, several years of thought and experimentation, all contained in one metal casing. The Japanese had been trying to solve a problem that American submarines had been trying to solve as well: how to move through water with minimal acoustic signature. But the Japanese approach was different from what the Americans had been attempting. It was, in some respects, superior. It was also, in other respects, fragile and prone to mechanical failure. The American engineers began to understand it. They began to see its limitations. They began to think about how to counter it, or how to incorporate elements of it into American submarines. They also realized something else. If this device existed, and if the Japanese Navy had deemed it worth installing on their best submarines, then the Japanese were running out of options. They were experimenting because conventional approaches were failing. They were innovating from desperation. Within 6 months, the Americans had begun the process of retrofit, not copying the Japanese device exactly, but incorporating principles derived from it into their own submarine designs. They also began to search for other Japanese submarines that might be carrying similar systems. They began to train their sonar operators to recognize the acoustic signature of Japanese boats equipped with these new systems. They began to plan future encounters with that specific knowledge in mind. The effect was almost immediate. Japanese submarines, having invested significant resources in developing a system that they believed would give them an acoustic advantage, found that advantage neutralized almost overnight. It was as though the Americans had been handed the key to understanding Japanese submarine development. It was as though they could read the minds of the designers in Tokyo, but the human cost was not abstract. The submarine that had carried the device and that had been forced to surface and be sunk by the USS Kendrick had gone down with 102 men aboard. Only 37 survived, rescued by the American destroyer, interrogated, and eventually held as prisoners of war for the remainder of the conflict. Captain Isamu Tanaka was among those survivors. He was pulled from the water by American sailors, treated for hypothermia and minor injuries, and taken below deck to the crew's quarters. There, in a state of shock and numbness that surpassed even the cold, he was given hot water and a blanket. And as he slowly returned to awareness, as his mind began to function again beyond the immediate demands of survival, he realized what had happened. He realized that the drive system was gone. He realized that by an act of chance, by a combination of equipment failure and human error and the fog of war, he had delivered to the Americans the very device that the Navy had intended him to protect. In the days that followed, as he was interrogated by American officers trying to extract information about the system, trying to understand its purpose, he chose to remain silent. This was, in some ways, futile. The Americans had the device itself. They could determine its purpose through examination, but Tanaka remained silent anyway, not out of defiance, but out of a kind of hollow resignation. The war was lost. It had been lost for some time. This was simply another manifestation of that reality. In the months that followed, the strategic situation in the Pacific shifted in ways that were subtle but consequential. American submarines, now equipped with better understanding of acoustics and Japanese submarine tactics, began to have greater success against Japanese shipping. The effectiveness of Japanese submarines, already diminished, declined further. The noose around Japan tightened, but the device itself, recovered that night in the darkness of the Pacific, that single metal casing containing years of Japanese engineering, became something more than just a piece of military hardware. It became a symbol of the nature of modern warfare, of how information moves and transforms the battlefield, of how advantage in war is often measured not in firepower, but in knowledge and understanding. The sailors of the USS Kendrick, who had pulled that casing from the water, had no idea what they were retrieving. They were following orders, doing their duty, doing what sailors do in wartime. But by accident, by the intervention of pure chance and the breakdown of Japanese systems, they had altered the trajectory of the Pacific War. Captain Tanaka, moved to a prisoner of war camp in the United States, eventually survived the war. He was repatriated in 1946. He lived for another 30 years, never speaking publicly about the war, never discussing what had happened in that submarine on that night in October 1944. The war had taken something from him that could not be returned. The device, after the war, was studied by American engineers and then classified and filed away in archives. It was eventually declassified decades later and mentioned in academic papers about World War II naval history. It became a footnote, a curiosity, something discussed in specialist circles. But for those who understood naval warfare, for those who understood the role that information plays in determining the outcome of conflicts, it represented something more profound. The Pacific War was not won because one side had more ships or more planes or more men. It was won because one side increasingly understood the capabilities of the other, because technology and human knowledge combined to create advantage, because by accident and by the intervention of fate, systems that seemed perfect were exposed, were understood, were countered. A single component, retrieved from the sea, became part of the chain of events that led to victory. If this story fascinates you, if you want to hear more about the hidden histories of World War II, about the moments where human error and chance determined the fate of nations, then please make sure you subscribe to this channel now. Because we have dozens more stories like this one, stories about the people who lived through history, about the choices they made and the consequences that rippled outward from those choices. Subscribe and join our community of history enthusiasts who understand that the real story of war is not always found in the official records. It's found in the small moments, the unexpected turns, the human encounters that shape the world we live in. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.